Welcome back. Happy New Year. Nice to see all familiar faces back in this room and a lot of new faces as well. So thank you for joining us for the HPL seminar. We'll be running throughout the semester as well as into spring. Just a few announcements to make before I get started. If you're in class CNES 396, you're in the right place. And then if you are in that class, please stay after the seminar is done. Don't leave. Your class goes on after we leave as well. So how this works here at seminar is we have the presenter, they'll talk and present their talk, and then we'll open the floor for some questions, and I'll moderate to help you get your questions across. And then once that's done, we'll all leave and the class will continue in this room. So again, thank you for joining us. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Keely Shaw, who is a postdoctoral associate here in the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology at University of Calgary, under the supervision of Dr. Jane Schurer and Dr. Jill Parnell. Her research focuses on the interplay between physical activity and nutrition in order to optimize health and physical function across diverse populations. Dr. Shaw completed her PhD in kinesiology at the University of Saskatchewan in 2023, and her doctoral research examined the biofortification of plant-based food products and their applications to athletes. She was supervised by Dr. Philip Chilbeck and Dr. Gordon Zello, and prior to that, she earned her Master of Science in Kinesiology also at the University of Saskatchewan, where she studied the effects of dark chocolate on metabolism and performance in trained cyclists. In addition to her academic achievements, Dr. Shaw brings a truly unique applied perspective to her work. She is actually a two-time Paralympic medalist in track cycling and a six-time World Championship medalist across track and road cycling. And outside of her research in sport, she's happiest when she's outdoors and is a self-proclaimed coffee snob. Today, Dr. Shaw will be presenting her work on sport nutrition considerations for the para-athletes. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Keely Shaw.
Thanks so much, Ashna, and thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to start off our seminar for the 2026 year. So as we go through today, a lot of what I'm talking about is really going to be theoretical because as we're going to chat, when we're talking about para-athletes, we have next to no research. We do a lot of pulling the best that we know. We pull a lot of anecdotal evidence. We pull a lot of clinical perspectives in order to try to best serve these athletes and help them to reach their optimal performance goals. But before we get too far into nutrition and how we apply it to para-athletes, I always like to start by actually defining what a para-athlete is. So typically when people think of para-athletes, they might think of people who use wheelchairs, and they might think of people with various limb deficiencies. And while those impairments likely do make up the vast majority of our para-athlete population, it is by no means an exhaustive list. So when we think about a para-athlete, this is going to be any sort of athlete with a physical or visual impairment, such that they meet a certain criteria to be what we would call classifiable within parasport. So this can be an impairment in function. So maybe all of the parts are there, they're just not moving quite right, or in the case of visual impairments, structure of the eye is fine, but there's something that is impeding their actual sight, making it so that they don't see as clearly. This could be things like complete non-movement or paralysis, or it could be impairments in motor function, ataxia, hypertonia, spasticity, general irregularities in the way that people move. It can also be then impaired structure. So there's actually something anatomically different. When we're looking at para-athletes, whether it's the impaired structure or function, this can be congenital, meaning that the individual is born that way, or it might be acquired, often through some sort of traumatic injury or illness. Because many para-athletes become impaired later in life, we do see that the average age of the para-athlete tends to be quite a bit higher than that in an able-bodied population. So whereas at the Olympic Games, we're probably looking at 16 to 25, 30 at the upper ends. In parasport, we're probably average age 40 to 60. Friends with one Australian cyclist who won a silver medal at the Tokyo Paralympics 2 days before her 60th birthday. So it really does change your whole long-term athlete development. And it does mean then that we're working with alterations to physiology related to aging as well as related to the impairment. So para-athletes really can be quite a diverse, heterogeneous group of athletes. In this picture, we see just, again, a couple of Canadian athletes, some of which if you were to see on the street, you might say, yes, that person could compete at Paralympic Games, but many of them you wouldn't. I've gone to 2 Paralympic Games, and typically when I tell people that, they kind of look at me and you can see the wheels turning in their head, and they're like, they're trying to find a way to say, but what's wrong with you? And they're trying, sometimes they just say it, sometimes they try to find a more PC way of saying it. But it just goes to show that para-athletes show up in many different bodies with many different abilities. And because we have such a heterogeneous group, it does mean that whether we're training them, coaching them, giving nutritional advice, assessing them, things get a little bit more complex and a little bit more nuanced. So when we're thinking about different impairments that might lead to somebody being classified as a para-athlete, we talked about structure and function. And realistically, what that means is oftentimes we see a lot of spinal cord injury. We see a lot of limb deficiencies. We might see things like stroke, cerebral palsy, complications due to different surgeries. So maybe there was a nerve impingement following a tumor removal due to cancer. Multiple sclerosis can be a quite common one. In some sports, we have things like short stature or people with different forms of dwarfism, leg length differences. So it really is a very wide variety of different types of impairments. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. In this picture, this was our cycling team for the World Championships in Italy in 2018. And even within a single sport, things can look quite different. So in this picture, we have the 3 gentlemen on the bottom. They're all wheelchair users, obviously, spinal cord injuries. In the back row, we have everything from degenerative nerve diseases, visual impairments, brain injuries, musculoskeletal disorders, from traumatic birth. So it really is quite a broad range of athletes. And the type of athlete, the type of impairment that we're going to see will vary depending on the sport, with some sports being a lot broader, something like cycling, where there's pretty much classification for almost any type of impairment, or a lot more narrow, where we have something like wheelchair rugby that is almost exclusively for quadriplegics, goalball exclusively for visual impairments. So now when we start to think about different considerations that we need to make when we're working with para-athletes from a nutritional standpoint, it really is quite complex. So depending on the nature and the degree of their impairment is really going to drive where our considerations come. If somebody has a high-level spinal cord injury, lots of, or a high level of paralysis, not a lot of functioning muscles, that means we're going to have reduced lean body mass, reduced energy expenditure as a result of that. In some cases, with central nervous system impairments like nerve diseases or cerebral palsy, we have these movement disorders that lead to things like spasticity and actually are increasing energy expenditure just involuntarily. Depending on the athlete, there might be issues with the actual act of eating. Chewing and swallowing might be a concern, which is then going to change what sort of foods are available to fuel their performance. We have alterations in things like hormonal responses. Our para-athletes are often on a bit of a polypharmacy to manage symptoms related to their impairment, which can then impact their hunger levels. And then we see impacts on digestion, whether that is delayed colon transit time, gut dysbiosis, and then potentially limitations in their bone mineral density or reduced bone mineral density, largely around not getting that contact force with walking. So this I have, it's kind of a nice little video. I'm going to skip forward to the interesting part. This is an athlete with cerebral palsy. So he is a runner. And I just want us to pay attention to, as we see videos of him running, the way he runs appears very different to what we would see in an able-bodied runner. He is inefficient. He's kind of got limbs going all over the place. He's bouncing a lot, and this is it's a very inefficient movement. And this is not uncommon at the Paralympic Games, depending on the level of impairment. So we can now imagine if this individual, I believe he's a distance runner. I can't remember exactly, I believe he's a distance runner, so 5, 10K. The amount of energy it actually takes to travel 10 kilometers with a movement like we saw just a couple seconds ago is going to be significantly higher than what we would expect in an able-bodied individual who doesn't have some of those extraneous movements that are involuntary. In addition to some of these movement inefficiencies potentially impacting energy expenditure, we also are going to see differences in thermal regulation, particularly in our spinal cord injured population. Because we have less lean body mass in those with different levels of paralysis, this is going to impact things like lactate accumulation, lactate clearing, and it does then really need to take into account the person in front of us and what that means and how we can best support them. So I do want to I'm going to go over some of the more common impairments really quickly so that when we actually start talking about nutritional considerations and recommendations, we know what we're dealing with and how these might differ based on the person. So when we're looking at spinal cord injury, again, likely probably one of the more common impairments at high-level para sport. This is going to vary quite a lot depending on where along the spinal cord the injury is. We might see partial or complete loss in motor and or sensory function below the level of the lesion, and this is going to include sweating below the level of the lesion and therefore implications for thermal regulation. Because we have paralysis and loss of function below that level of the lesion in various degrees, this is going to have quite significant impacts on things like our ability to store glycogen, because if you have less muscle, we have less opportunity to store glycogen, as well as impacts on energy expenditure, as we know that lean body mass is going to be the primary determinant of energy expenditure, particularly at rest. We also then have some health implications with this population, particularly around things like their bone mineral density and their bowel and bladder regulation. So one of the big concerns with spinal cord injured individuals, whether athlete or not, is neurogenic bowel and neurogenic bladder dysfunction. We have disruption in the autonomic response of the body, which can lead to trouble bathrooming, can make kind of all of life just a little bit more complex. Another very common impairment in parasport is hemiplegia. Hemiplegia is just when we have differences in function of the body from left to right. So when we talk about spinal cord injury, this is typically going to be classified as paraplegia, meaning 2 limbs affected. This is typically going to be the legs, and then at what point in the abdomen the paralysis starts will depend on level of the lesion, or quadriplegia, tetraplegia is also another word, if all 4 limbs are affected. With hemiplegia, instead of splitting the body top and bottom, it's going to split the body left to right, depending on the region and the side of the brain that was impacted. Most common injuries or diagnoses leading to hemiplegia are going to be brain injuries, whether that is traumatic or acquired, or cerebral palsy. So again, can be congenital or can be acquired. Hemiplegia is largely a movement disorder, so we don't see quite the same impact as we do in spinal cord injury. We have less impact to the autonomic nervous system, but we do see quite significant impacts to the overall movement and particularly voluntary movement. So some athletes may require mobility devices, whether those are things like wheelchairs, canes, walkers, whatever it might be. And often we see high levels of spasticity. So this is kind of a involuntary contraction of one or more limbs. And this can be triggered by external stimuli like stress or lack of sleep, what have you. And there can be hypertonia or dystonia. So the muscles are contracting either chronically or at inopportune or inappropriate times. And then we have limb deficiencies. And really the impact of limb deficiency is going to depend on where and how much of the limb we are missing. If it's just a hand and you're a cyclist, probably not as impactful as if it's a transhumeral. That was the wrong bone. Sorry. So if you have this is going to really impact, again, related to the amount of lean body mass that somebody has. If we have a transfemoral amputation or limb deficiency, and now suddenly we're missing all of the lean body mass that would typically be associated with that leg, that's a lot of lean body mass that that person now does not have, and also a lot of just cross-sectional bodily area that could allow for things like heat dissipation. Depending on where the deficiency is, if it's a limb that is used for ambulation, that could impact their movement efficiency, particularly if they do not have a well-fitting prosthetic. And then lastly, we have our visual impairments. So I kind of give our VIs, visual impairments, an honorary mention here. When it comes to nutrition, their requirements are going to really be quite similar to that of an able-bodied population, as for all intents and purposes, their body is able, it is their eyes or their vision that is impacted. But where they might struggle a little bit more is with shopping, with preparing food, with choosing the right food that they need to fuel their performance at, let's say, a buffet. This becomes increasingly difficult when they're out of their regular environment, like we would see with high-level athletes as they travel to compete. So we're going to go over, now that we kind of know what a para-athlete is and what we can expect physiologically, we're going to talk real quick about what we know about para-athletes and nutrition, and then we're going to get into what this actually means. So the first thing we know about para-athletes and nutrition is that para-athletes don't actually know that much about nutrition. So in some research, we see that less than half of the para-athletes surveyed were able to answer questions on basic nutritional principles, let alone when we start thinking about the nuance of adding in physical activity and sport. But what we also know is that those basic guidelines and those basic guidelines that are adapted based on able-bodied individuals might not directly apply to a para-athlete population based on differences in physiology that we've already gone through. So if we take our able-bodied guidelines and we blindly apply them to a para-athlete population, we are likely doing a huge disservice to these athletes. And then based on the huge variety of not only types of impairment, but also then degrees of impairment within different subclasses, we know that we really need to take the whole person that's in front of us into consideration, considering what their impairment is and how they actually present before we can make good evidence-based decisions, or as close to evidence-based as you can get when you don't actually have an evidence base. When it comes to the actual dietary intake of para-athletes, so this data is from elite paracyclists from around the world. And what we found with this is that largely our athletes were meeting or exceeding dietary recommendations, sometimes going so far as 1,000% over our dietary reference intakes. But we did see some pretty astounding findings both on the low end of intake and the high end of intake. So the first one I want to point out is our fiber. So when we look at fiber intake, now it appears that at least in our females, they are going a little bit above our DRIs. This is relating, that's an average, right? So when we actually look at dietary intakes, only about half of our female athletes were meeting the adequate intake value of 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories, and only 25% of males. So we're seeing grossly underconsumption of dietary fiber with this group, which then has potential impacts when we think about some of the gut dysbiosis, shifting in the microbiota, and neurogenic bowel dysfunction that is common in this population. We also see some intakes of our micronutrients that are exceedingly high. So now, particularly with some of these B vitamins, where it shows 1,000% of our dietary reference intake, it actually goes above that. My graph just, if I put my y-axis any higher, it would be too distorted. And a lot of what these micronutrients, they weren't coming from food. a lot of these excessive intakes were coming from dietary supplements, multivitamins, multi-minerals. So we actually had a handful, probably about 20% of our athletes, who were habitually consuming different micronutrients above the upper limit, or the tolerable upper limit, where would be we don't really want to go above that. That's where we start to see symptoms in some of the most sensitive of individuals. So this was really concerning, as we're starting to see a kind of disconnect. Typically, we would assume lots of micronutrients is related to lots of things like whole grains, fruits and vegetables, which would then come with high levels of fiber. But we didn't necessarily see this. Typically in the broader literature, a lot of other reports in para-athletes have suggested low fiber as well, so that's a pretty common finding, but also inadequate intakes of things like iron, vitamin D, calcium, and sometimes zinc. So it does appear that maybe some of these athletes are aware of the common insufficiencies and are supplementing, but then going overboard with it. When we looked at where this food was actually coming from, it did seem that our athletes were not consuming enough what we would consider a generally healthy diet: fruits and vegetables, meat alternatives, whole grains. So now if we kind of take some of this background knowledge and we actually look at how we can apply this and make recommendations for our para athletes. We're going to break this down based largely on our macronutrients. So if we start off with our energy needs, when we're looking at energy requirements for sport, we have a very fine balance that we're trying to make. We need to have enough energy to recover from exercise. We need to have adequate substrate availability to support that exercise. We need to optimize body weight and composition. That's going to vary based on whatever sport you're in. But we also need to maximize health. And only when all of those areas are optimized can we truly optimize exercise performance. So a lot of times what we're seeing, and particularly in the para-athlete population, is not enough energy being consumed relative to their requirements for sports. And now this gets a little bit messy because we also generally, with our low energy intake, we associate that with what we call REDS, or relative energy deficiency in sport. And we can diagnose REDS based on a variety of different markers, from hormone levels to bone mineral density to dietary habits. But a lot of what we would typically use to shift towards thinking we might be looking at a case of REDS in an able-bodied population, those markers are already impacted in para-athletes due to their condition. So it does get a little bit more complex there. We also know that energy, we might need more energy for a given exercise based on movement inefficiencies. And our athletes are still going to want to try to optimize quality of intake, quantity of intake when they're consuming things, and periodizing that intake based on their training. Specific to para-athletes, our energy requirements are going to shift largely based on the amount of lean body mass they have. Again, lean body mass is going to be the greatest contributor to energy expenditure, particularly at rest, but also during exercise. Some of our athletes, because we have hormonal differences, especially in things like leptin, some athletes those with cerebral palsy tend to have higher levels of leptin, which means they're going to be less hungry. They're going to have a lower drive to eat, or they might be on medications that might shift their hunger up or down. So it can make getting enough energy and enough calories quite challenging. When we think about carbohydrates and para-athletes are going to be used for all of the same things as we see in able-bodied individuals. But again, we need to start thinking about not only lean body mass here. We know that glycogen is going to be stored in lean body mass. If we have less lean body mass, that's less opportunity to store glycogen. But also in our spastic individuals, spasticity is a very intense contraction. Whether you mean to or not, that contraction still requires energy, and that energy is largely going to be coming from carbohydrates. So we are going to be burning through carbohydrates at a greater rate than an able-bodied population or somebody without spasticity might. A lot of our athletes might struggle with thermoregulation, whether that is not sweating or even it might be voluntary. If we think of somebody with spinal cord injury, if you're an alpine skier and you are going out for a couple runs, if you need to go to the bathroom at the top of the hill, you don't just go to the chalet that's at the top of the hill like anybody else. Your chair is at the bottom. So essentially your legs are at the bottom of the hill. So you have the option of essentially getting down to the hill to your chair and then going to the bathroom, or you have somebody carry you to the bathroom at the top of the lift if there is one there. So now logistics start to get a little bit more complicated. So a lot of athletes who use wheelchairs might actually underhydrate because they don't want to have to go to the bathroom when it's inopportune. So carbohydrates can be beneficial here by helping with hydration. We know that carbohydrates are stored with water, so that's just one of the strategies we can use. We also talked about fiber and how our athletes tend to not consume enough fiber. This, less so for performance, but from a health perspective, is really important. Again, we know particularly those with spinal cord injuries tend to present with gut dysbiosis, neurogenic bowel dysfunction, general GI distress. And the thought is that, well, fiber is going to make this worse, so I'm going to reduce it more. And well, yes, if you have too much fiber all at once, we do feel pretty gross. But what we want to do is we want to try to slowly increase fiber intake to help to regulate bowel function, to help to facilitate a healthy gut. When we're thinking about protein, again, protein is used for the exact same things in an athlete with impairments as it is for an athlete with an able-bodied athlete. But protein is really kind of it's a very interesting one physiologically if we're thinking about it when it comes to para-athletes. So on one hand, lower lean body mass, probably lower protein requirements, but that kind of gets accounted for because our requirements are in grams per kilo per day, using that overall body weight as a surrogate for lean body mass. But with our para-athletes, particularly those who are prone to pressure sores or ulcers, so this might be athletes that use a wheelchair or athletes that have a prosthetic. If it's not fitted well, they might get a lot of pressure sores. Protein is really important to help with wound healing, so that might actually start to bump their protein requirements up. So now maybe they need to be on the higher end of these ranges. But particularly in those with, let's say, tetraplegia, they might have actually lower energy requirements as a whole because they have less lean body mass. So the amount of protein that we would be wanting them to get as a percentage of their overall caloric intake can actually be quite high. And that can be quite a challenge to try to meet these protein requirements without putting them into an unintentional energy surplus. When the one macronutrient that you might notice is missing from these slides is fat. And that's because from a sport nutrition perspective, fat is kind of just a way to get enough energy. And from a para-athlete perspective, if anything, para-athletes tend to consume more fat as a percentage of their total intake than what we might necessarily want to see. With our para-athletes, both found in that study that we looked at the micronutrients earlier, as well as others, they tend to consume not enough carbohydrates for their activity. Protein tends to be adequate or maybe even a little bit high, and fat intake tends to be quite high, upwards of about 40% of their total caloric intake, which is, when you're an endurance athlete and we are running on carbohydrates, is quite high. When it comes to micronutrients, we had looked at the actual intake data from that study in paracyclists, but when it comes to actual needs and nutrients that we might want to pay particular attention to, a couple that I've highlighted here are iron, vitamin D, and calcium. So iron is one that's really quite interesting, and maybe that's just because that's the bulk of my research area. But in para-athletes, a lot of para-athletes are going to present with chronic low-grade inflammation. And now this is a bit of a double whammy when it comes to iron. When we're measuring iron status, we measure that in the form of ferritin, which is stored iron. But inflammation tends to artificially inflate our ferritin values. So now we're going to be reading values higher than what they maybe necessarily are. This can lead us to believe that our athletes have adequate iron stores, when in reality, they might actually be running on the low end. With this chronic low-grade inflammation, we also can see chronically kind of low-grade increased hepcidin, and hepcidin is going to reduce iron absorption. So now we're looking at potentially low stores in the body, indicating increased need, but also reduced absorption due to this hormonal response. While we didn't see it in that data I showed you from our lab with the paracyclists, a lot of other dietary intake data in this population do suggest that dietary intake of iron might be insufficient. So now we have increased need, reduced absorption, and reduced intake. We kind of got a trifecta here for iron deficiency. And then if your athlete is dealing with GI disturbances, typically this is going to be our spinal cord injured individuals, they might start to restrict key sources of iron. So while we don't have a lot of actual food source data in the literature, anecdotally, I know a lot of my friends who have spinal cord injuries will intentionally reduce their intake of things like red meat because it tends to increase their gastrointestinal symptoms. They might not eat a lot of things like pulses, your lentils, your chickpeas that have high iron because those come with high fiber. And if you have too much of that, that also increases GI disturbances. So it does kind of lead to this perfect storm of the potential for iron deficiency. However, we don't actually know anything about the iron status of para athletes. So we've got some work that we're just in the planning stages of to try to get a global team of researchers to put together all of our iron status data from para athletes around the world to try to get an idea about what the iron status of different para athletes, different impairments, different countries actually is and how that compares to an able-bodied population. The other micronutrients I've highlighted are vitamin D and calcium. So some dietary intake data suggests that these micronutrients are not consumed adequately by para athletes. And this can be actually really important, particularly for those athletes who are non-ambulatory or non-weight bearing. We know that walking and those ground contact forces are a huge stimulus for bone turnover and therefore bone synthesis essentially. But if you don't have that, we're going to be at risk for low bone mass and then increased risk for fracture. And now we can't talk about athletes without talking about supplements. So this is some really cool data from Robin Madden, who did her PhD here at the UC. And Dr. Madden looked at supplement use in para athletes and included a variety of different types of supplements. So everything from multivitamins, minerals, to your more classically considered ergogenic aids, creatine, caffeine, branched chain amino acids. And what she found was that, like we might expect with any athlete population, the use of dietary supplements was very prevalent. So every single male that took part in her research reported consuming supplements at least sometimes in the last 3 months. And with our females, over 90%. So we have this huge gap now between what we know about supplements that work and the supplements athletes are actually taking. And while in the able-bodied literature, we have study after study, review after review on some of your big supplements like creatine and caffeine and your buffers, your sodium bicarbonate, the same cannot be said of our para athletes. So we did a systematic review during my PhD where we were looking at all ergogenic aids. So this was a very, very wide search across pretty much any parameter of physical performance we could come up with in any sort of physical impairment that might be classifiable in a sport. And after combing through 19,000 articles, we found 15. And of those 15 papers, not necessarily surprising, heavy hitters, caffeine and creatine, kind of makes sense that the most of the research would be in those supplements, as most of the research in able-bodied athletes are also in those supplements. But if we were to combine and look at all of the studies on caffeine in able-bodied athletes, or all the studies on creatine in able-bodied individuals, these numbers pale in comparison. So we have about 5 studies each. And then we have a couple in a few other supplements from fish oil, more of that dietary supplement, sodium citrate as a buffer ergogenic aid. And when we look at the athletes that these were actually studied in, it's really quite varied. So most of the research was in spinal cord injured individuals, which again, not super surprising. I would say the bulk of the athletes at the highest level in parasport tend to be those with spinal cord injuries. But also from a research perspective, spinal cord injury is a little bit easier to study because we can neatly classify them based on level of sensory impairment, motor impairment, level of the injury. Whereas a lot of other impairments tend to be a little bit messier, or we just have a lower population to draw from. The one thing that we also see in the literature when it comes to parasport is our athletes simply being classified as wheelchair athletes. So while we might assume now, okay, those are probably spinal cord injured athletes, we don't actually know. Wheelchair athletes can encompass everything from spinal cord injury, brain injury, limb deficiency. Actually, up until I think it was 2023, you could technically be able-bodied and play wheelchair basketball. So classification or description of the athlete as wheelchair athletes doesn't necessarily give us enough information in order to understand who we're working with and what that means. So with this systematic review, ultimately, we weren't able to really make any strong recommendations, but based on what we know from the able-bodied literature, based on the findings of these handful of studies, and with a halfway decent understanding of the pathophysiology, we have a few aspects that we're able to at least now make recommendations based on. So if we think of caffeine, we know caffeine is the most widely used drug in the world, and because caffeine is in fact a drug, it has different response in the body, what we call pharmacokinetics. Well, when we start talking about people with spinal cord injuries, those pharmacokinetics are shifted. And that shift varies depending on where the level of the lesion is. So whereas in our able-bodied athletes, we tend to say take 3 to 6 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram body weight about 45 minutes before your activity, and that is our optimal dosing regime. When we have somebody with a spinal cord injury, it appears that in our tetraplegics, or all 4 limbs being affected, it takes a little bit longer to reach peak caffeine levels in the blood. So caffeine needs to be taken a little bit further out from exercise, maybe close to that 60 to 75 minutes before exercise. And with our paraplegics, it actually is a lower dose that seemingly has the greatest effect. So we need to shift our dosing recommendations. Creatine can also be, or caffeine, sorry, can also be a bit of a double-edged sword here when we're talking about para-athletes. On one hand, in some of our impairments that might struggle, or athletes that might struggle with things like decision-making or cognition related to their impairment, caffeine can help with that. Caffeine can increase your acuity a little bit. It can help you focus. It can help you make decisions faster in a game of play. But if you're already spasticity prone, you already have some involuntary movements. We all know what happens when we have too much caffeine, we get a little bit jittery. So you pair that with a spastic individual, and now that impact can actually override any performance enhancing effects. So we really need to take the person in front of us into consideration before we decide whether or not caffeine is going to be beneficial. Creatine was another one that was really quite interesting, largely because whereas in able-bodied populations, we see quite a clear trend towards improvements with appropriate dosing strategies. We're always going to have some responders, non-responders with creatine, but largely as a whole, we see a pretty clean improvement in things like muscular strength and muscular size. When we look at para-athletes, that's not necessarily the case. So we see quite a mix from some studies showing improvements in things that we might not expect, like VO2 max, increased peak power, increased muscle cross-sectional area. We see other research suggesting no changes in strength, no changes in muscular size. And it does seem that when we compare those that see effects versus those that don't in para-athletes, then maybe para-athletes just need maybe a higher dose or a longer dosing protocol. So for whatever reason, it seems that maybe it just takes longer for para athletes to saturate to the same level of able-bodied individuals such that they're going to see improvements. That said, we do see some improvements in clinical features in different neurological conditions, particularly things like muscular dystrophy, which is pretty impressive given the ease of creatine acquisition. You don't need a prescription for it. Generally, highly tolerated, robust safety profile, and potentially other health benefits. So it's kind of cool that we're seeing improvements in some clinical features around like neuromuscular fatigue, even without a training program associated with it. When we think about fish oil, this is a very common sports supplement and probably a very common dietary supplement, regardless of athlete status or not. In para athletes, the theory is that low-grade inflammation, maybe fish oil can help with it. And in the singular study with wheelchair basketball players, they did see reductions in inflammation. They did see reductions in muscle damage following exercise, and now we can debate whether or not that's something we want or not. But there's also some thought that there might be some benefits over and above sport performance, particularly for para athletes. With our athletes with conditions of the central nervous system, multiple sclerosis, brain injury, spinal cord injury, there is some thought that fish oil might actually have a bit of a neuroprotective effect, improving outcomes related to those conditions. Another one that was quite interesting was looking at leucine as an individual amino acid. So typically when we think about individual amino acid as supplements for able-bodied athletes, you get laughed out of the room. Because generally we're speaking about amino acids as they relate to muscle protein synthesis, and we know that we need all of the amino acids, not just these one or groups such as the branched chain amino acids. But in the one study we saw with leucine in individuals with cerebral palsy, even without a resistance training protocol, we saw improvements in muscular strength and size, and also some improvements in overall wellness, so things like sleep quality and just how they felt. Now, there is some theory that leucine in particular might be beneficial for aspects of fatigue, as leucine uses the same transporter across the blood-brain barrier as tryptophan, which can lead to feelings of fatigue and sleepiness. So there's some theory there, but we don't have enough evidence to actually suggest that it would be beneficial. And then the other studies we looked at, or the other supplements we looked at, that were found, largely we don't see any effect, but a lot of these were limited by small sample size or not ideal study designs. But this is kind of the name of the game when we're working with parasport. If we think that people with disabilities, physical impairments make up about 15% of the global population, if we take that percentage now and the percentage of those that are physically active at an athletic point where they would be called athletes, we're drawing from a very small sample. In my dietary intake data, I had 32 people, and reviewers kept coming back saying your sample's too small, your sample's too small. I had something like 40% of the global population. You show me another study that has 40% of the global population. It's just that our population is quite low. There does seem to be some promise though. So in things like nitrates, the research found 2% improvement in time trial performance, 2.6% improvement in time trial performance in those consuming nitrates compared to like 0.3% improvement in the control. And not statistically significant, again, likely limited by sample size. But also if we start thinking at high-level athletic populations, 2% difference in performance is the difference from podiuming and coming like back to the pack. So that can be quite clinically meaningful. So taking this all together, we really don't know anything about para athletes when it comes to sport nutrition and using nutrition supplements to best support their athletic performance. So this is a huge gap in the literature. And we're starting to slowly see some of the big names in exercise physiology come to the table with para athletes. We're starting to see more of that come up. Names like Trent Stelling, we're starting to look at para-athletes, Luke Van Loon, so it's coming. But the literature is very much in its infancy, which can be very frustrating for these athletes. I remember being in the village at the Pan Am Games and I was talking to different athletes and I think I defended my PhD like 4 days after I got back from Pan Am's. And so I was telling them about what I was doing, so I was always in there studying. And time after time, all the athletes had to say was like, man, thanks for doing this work. Because as athletes, they want to see people like them in the literature so that they know how to best support their own performance. They're out there trying to get a gold medal just like any of the able-bodied athletes are, and they feel like they're flying blind because we don't have the evidence base for practitioners to be able to help them out. What we do know though, is that while the overarching overarching principles of sport nutrition are still going to apply, we do still need to take into consideration the person in front of us and make recommendations based on specific pathophysiology related to their impairment. And over and above everything, we just need to do the research. Reviewers are going to come at us and tell us that we didn't have enough people, that our sample size wasn't big enough. But we need to keep doing the research, work on collaborations. Again, we've got some pretty cool research looking at an international collaborative research group so that we can try to get a good sample to actually get a better understanding. And it's only once that the para-athletes start to be represented in the literature that then it's going to snowball. We're going to see more, and now there's going to be more funding available for para-athletes. We're going to see better performances at the highest level, like the Paralympic Games, and we're going to start to see a little bit more equity between our para-athletes and our able-bodied athletes. So with that, I would love to welcome any questions.
Floor is open for questions. Start us off. Bill.
I'm just curious, what information or what resources do the athletes actually have? One, in terms of what they need nutritionally, but two, also in terms of what their body is actually getting in. So you can say, because you said it how variable it is, even from athlete to athlete, how informed are they about it?
So this is really going to vary quite a lot. So the research where we had less than 50% of athletes adequately answering questions, suggesting they're not getting that knowledge, that was high-level elite athletes. If we assume then that they are having things like dietetic support, which would be where they get the most of their information, now our grassroots athletes, they probably have nothing. They're probably going based on, for being perfectly honest, social media, because that's where they know where to go. And there are some actually kind of cool social media pages around nutrition specifically for people with different impairments. But there's also some other research we've got in the bucket is a educational module around sport nutrition for people with impairments. We're focusing on spinal cord injury right now. But even the practitioners around them, unless they've worked with para-athletes before, are just doing the best they can. So really, to answer your question, they're getting at the highest level, if they have things like dietetic support, physiology support, they're getting it from that integrated sport team. But a lot of physicians don't have that background. Like physicians aren't super well trained in nutrition to begin with, let alone nutrition related to sports or to condition specific. So a lot of them are kind of just going based on, I guess, colloquial knowledge, for want of a better term. Does that answer your question?
Sure. Thank you for the presentation. So you mentioned that there's like quite a bit of caffeine use. I was just wondering if that differs for individuals with a spinal cord injury because it is a diuretic. So do they tend to like not want to use it as much, or like just anecdotally, have you noticed anything like that?
I'm not aware of anything in the literature. Anecdotally, I see a lot of people with spinal cord injuries drinking a lot of caffeine. That's just like my very small subset of friends essentially, but I haven't seen it as being a limiting factor. Realistically, the amount of caffeine that they're consuming leading into a race isn't going to be enough to have a huge diuretic effect. If we think of exercise physiology, if they're going into in my sport, cycling, so into a race, blood is going to be diverted away from the kidneys anyway, so that's going to reduce the urge to urinate.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I was wondering, how does the classification system work? if you're a para athlete, and and you want to be classified for cycling or any other sport, do you undergo physical tests or is this a medical test? How does that work?
So it's a little bit different from every sport. I can speak very, very clearly to cycling, and it will be quite similar across different sports. But so when we have national classifiers, so you can get classified in Canada. In cycling, your classification isn't official until you go international, but you're essentially seen by a panel. And this panel usually involves a medical classifier as well as a technical classifier. So your medical classifier will go and they'll essentially do a physical exam on you. Your physical exam is going to look very different depending on what your impairment is. That might be something like nerve conduction tests in the case of a degenerative nerve disease. That might be things like balance tests. They might look at reflexes. So really a full physical. These classifications take about an hour, hour and a half. And then your technical classifier might look at your prosthetic and how much of your impairment can a prosthetic make up for essentially. Or in the case of cycling, they're going to look at the bike. What sort of adaptations are on the bike and how much of your physical impairment can you overcome through mods to the bike essentially. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, no, I was thinking about, we just had a presentation a little while back with a long jumper who had a one-sided prosthetic to run and jump. And he jumped better, as good or better than most Olympic type athletes off the amputated leg, but not on the regular leg where his performance was like a meter or more shorter. So there it almost seemed that the disablement was actually an advantage for him to jump further, which he probably wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So
it's the story of Oscar Pistorius, right? Blade Runner. Now, for all the bad of Oscar Pistorius, that was a big thing. He could compete at the Paralympics and at the Olympics, and he was one of the able-bodied athletes out of the water because of the spring of his running blades, allowing to propel him faster, and just an improvement in efficiency. So this is where, in classification, you get classified based on the type as well as the degree of impairment. So in cycling, we first get classified based on the type of bike we ride. A tandem for visually impaired athletes, so you have a sighted athlete in the front, the visually impaired athlete in the back. Hand bikes for the age class, or individuals, might be spinal cord injury, might be double amps, whatever it might be. Tricycles for individuals with quite severe balance impairments, and then upright bikes, sometimes not always with modifications. And then within those large categories, you get further classified. So in the C class, the upright bike class, you have C1 being the most impaired. So I think there's a Spaniard in the C1 class who has amputation at the elbow on one side, shoulder on the other side, and transfemoral, and then the one full leg. So typically that means 3 or more limbs impacted. The highest level would be C5. That typically would be somebody with only an upper body impairment. And in cycling, that's not going to have a huge impact. So there are degrees, and there's always going to be gray areas. So para sport is definitely, it's not super clean. It's kind of almost like weight classes, except in weight classes, you can shift your weight to go heavier or lower. You're kind of stuck with the level of disability that somebody lives with. But it definitely is a consideration. And then when we start looking at wealth inequalities across countries, now this becomes even a bigger consideration because your more wealthy countries can afford the best equipment such that these athletes are performing at potentially a higher level than the Olympic athletes, whereas maybe less wealthy countries don't have the funds to support that type of equipment.
it's interesting that you say in your answer that you're stuck with your disability. You might be stuck with your disability. We just had a case of a cross-country skier that was relegated from one level to another one, and she wanted to be back in the old one. So the disability was the same, but the classification changed. So
yeah, it's really, again, quite messy. So sometimes the level of competition is actually higher in the more impaired class compared to the higher impaired. Sometimes people might you might shift your classification based if you have a degenerative condition specifically. Countries can come and challenge classifications if they think somebody is classified incorrectly. But it definitely, it gets quite messy from classification, both from an athlete perspective, an athlete psychological performance perspective, because it kind of messes with your mind when you know that you have more or less impairment compared to your competitors. And we're also trying to compare apples to oranges. So as much as we try to combine groups, in my class, we have people with multiple sclerosis, cerebral palsy, brain injury, amputation. That's a lot of different types of impairment. Some of them quite similar, some of them not. So you're really trying to compare apples to oranges and make the best situation that you can.
So the other thing that you mentioned was that para athletes tend to eat more fat
Mhm.
than you and I, well, us.
Able-bodied, in general, able-bodied
Yeah.
athletes.
And I was wondering if you had an explanation for that. And I also was wondering, you're also mentioning that they tend to have a low-level inflammation very often, like systemic inflammation. That's kind of what happens to, when we give our animals, our rats, high-fat sucrose diet, they also tend to get this systemic low-level inflammation. You think the two might be connected in para athletes, or is that?
They definitely could be. There could be that correlation, but we also see not like as a whole, these athletes tend to be consuming higher levels of fat, but also it's not always the case, right? So some of our athletes who are either eating insufficient amounts of fat or adequate, we're still seeing this level of chronic low-grade inflammation related to that impairment.
You mentioned they often have also GI disturbances. Is there a physiological reason for that, or?
So a lot of times, this is specific to spinal cord injured individuals. It's a lot of a dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system. So we're not having that same connection between the gut and the brain. Things move a little bit slower through the digestive system. We have longer colon transit time, leading to gas production, bloating. They might actually not be able to empty their bowels naturally, if you will. There's a lot of use of things like enemas or laxatives to help them empty their bowels.
A couple more things, but I let somebody else go.
Anyone else have some questions? Okay, Mauro, and then one back there.
Yeah, following up Walter's question, have you seen or what's happening in the people that it has disabilities, spinal cord injury, but they are sedentary? And do you see some exercise effect that could sort of protect or change this level of inflammation, or doesn't matter, these people without exercise, this is present muscle growth that they.
So I'm kind of gonna answer that in two parts. So first, when we start looking at that more biochemical systemic inflammation part of it, I'm actually not aware of that literature. I just haven't read it. I would imagine that those who exercise actually have reduced inflammation compared. Because if we're making the assumption that there's inflammation independent related to their impairment, now these sedentary individuals are going to have inflammation related to likely sedentary behavior, potentially inadequate dietary intake, which is going to compound that inflammation. Whereas we know in able-bodied individuals with exercise training, we actually have quite an improved anti-inflammatory effect. So our body is better able to fight inflammation. There is no reason why in the para-athlete population that would not hold true. So while I don't know, my educated guess is that those who are active probably have lower levels of inflammation compared to those who are sedentary. What we do see is particularly in those with quadriplegia, regardless of level of activity, we still see quite a bit of metabolic disturbances. So poor glucose handling, abdominal obesity, all of these things related to metabolic syndrome, high blood lipids. But again, if you are sedentary, that's just going to be compounded by a sedentary behavior. So while we can't necessarily get rid of these effects, it appears, we don't know yet, we don't have enough data, through exercise and diet, we definitely can help moderate and mitigate some of the negative effects.
And question back there, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so one thing that comes to mind is like sport fairness.
Mhm.
It sounds like it's a continuum for your impairment, and then so if you're looking at different bioavailability for whatever supplements you're taking, they can pose as like a greater advantage for certain athletes within that same classification. So like, how does that going to coincide with the research when looking at water or CCS and things, you know, what is banned, what is not banned based off of that bioavailability?
So I love that you're so optimistic that you think that water is gonna take into account the para-athlete literature. But first, in order for something to be banned by WADA, it has to meet 2 of 3 criteria. One, it has to actually improve your performance. It has to be illegal. And it has to have some sort of harm, potential for harm. So it has to meet 2 of those 3 in order to be banned. So we're really, when WADA's making these recommendations, it's going to look at the literature as a whole. And even in an able-bodied population, we're going to, again, we have responders, non-responders to things like creatine. We have fast metabolizers, slow metabolizers to caffeine. So that even in an able-bodied population, there's going to be a difference from nutrition perspective when we look at ergogenic aids. But WADA is really looking at it from a more safety perspective and a legality perspective. That aspect of real or thought to be real ergogenic effects or thought to be real improvements to performance, that it, I mean, people aren't going to use it if they don't think it works. But that is more on a large scale, not necessarily taking into consideration person A versus person B. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So is there drug testing in high level para competition?
Yep. Yeah, we get tested the exact same way the able-bodied population does. So whether that means WADA has to know where you are for at least an hour every single day, they show up whenever they want. Blood tests, urine tests. Yeah, so we are, as para-athletes, we are bound by the same anti-doping regulations, the same safe sport regulations, the same clean sport regulations.
Any other questions for Dr. Shaw? Think I saw, Benno, did you have a question before? No. Back to Walter.
Just, you know, when we have nutrition people coming in, they always talk about the gut microbiota, and you're talking about systemic inflammation, GI disturbances. So, and you know, we hear about fecal transplants being absolutely wonderful for treating certain things. And so, do you look at the gut microbiota? Is that a useful way to potentially evaluate?
There's definitely potential. So since coming to the UFC, I've been working a little bit more with the gut microbiota with Dr. Shear. And what we do see is in our spinal cord athletes in particular, they do tend to present with dysbiosis or kind of the composition of their gut is just different than it should be. There's less diversity typically, and we would often consider diversity to be a beneficial thing. But whether or not there is specific probiotics that you might consume that would help with things like GI distress is up in the air. I mean, we always think about kind of focusing on the 99% that's going to get you there, your sleep, your nutrition, before getting to that 1%. And from a gut microbiota perspective, that 99% is whole grains, lentils. It's a food first approach. So until we can get our athletes consuming adequate fiber, and adequate fiber in a para-athlete population might actually be different than an able-bodied population, as opposed to the 25 to 38 grams or so that might be recommended in able-bodied population. And people with spinal cord injuries, it's been recommended closer to 24, 25. But this is all kind of speculation, best guess. We don't actually have clinical data to support one or the other.
Yeah, go ahead.
On the page that you had the 3 months of like people taking the supplement.
Mhm.
I was just wondering, I saw there were energy drinks on there as well. So is it like, are those included in there, or is it like all nutrient enriched foods and drinks are good on the list, or is it just like, you know, like supplements that people take in pills?
So it's a little bit messy when we look at what is food and what is a supplement. We do start to understand it when we look at the regulatory bodies. So food is going to be essentially something you hear on my field. So something like an energy drink technically is a supplement. Something like a Gatorade is technically a supplement. So if it has a natural product number in Canada, that would be a supplement as opposed to a food. So on the list would have been pretty much anything that could be considered a dietary supplement, right? From powders and pills to things like energy drinks. So again, energy drinks are essentially just compounds with caffeine, sometimes it's creatine, sometimes it's nitrates, whatever it might be. It's essentially a concoction of different molecules of drugs, right?
I actually have a quick question. You mentioned on one of the slides that nitrates have some benefits and you have seen, I think it was like 2.6% or something that you mentioned. And this is from lack of my own knowledge of micronutrients. I've heard a lot of talk about nitrates being bad for us in a lot of like processed meats and stuff these days. And so what are the benefits of nitrates and why is it considered harmful in certain foods? Would you know anything about that?
So when we're thinking about nitrates in like deli meats, so these are synthetic nitrates that are typically put in as a preservative. What we're talking about is dietary nitrates, which is a little bit different. So we get dietary nitrates through beetroot juice, actually tends to be quite a lot, quite a high proportion, high percentage of nitrates. We get a lot there. And so when we take in dietary nitrates, it can be converted then to nitrites and then eventually to nitric oxide, which then has these huge vasodilatory effects. We can get improvements in blood flow, we can get improvements in oxygen delivery, nutrient delivery, where we don't see the same effects necessarily in those preservative nitrates.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, then let's thank Dr. Shaw for her talk.